was going off on a business trip, and I was in the airport, and I saw a little note sticking out of the pocket of my suitcase before I got on the airplane. It was a note from my oldest daughter, who at the time was about 16 years old. She had found history on our family computer that only could lead back to her father. Like a little nuclear bomb had dropped in my life, because all of a sudden, all of the carefully hidden things that I thought that I had been doing were being blown up. And I knew that there was just no going back. I couldn't cover that back up again and go back to life as it was.
Hey, Ron.
Hi, David.
Hey, welcome to the OneStrongMan podcast.
Love it. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's a podcast where we have honest and vulnerable conversation. And you're my first guest. Pleasure having you, sir.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Ron, I know you're very special to me, to a degree. Not as special as my wife, but you're very special to me.
Thank you for clarifying.
You and I go back, over almost 9 years now, correct?
I think so, yeah.
My accountability partner, a friend, also a good man a good man of God. You've been married for almost 32 years, a father of 4 kids.
Right.
A former vice president of a Fortune 100 company, so very successful in your career. You and I kind of started our relationship we had this hate-love relationship when we just first met.
Yes.
It's not that because I didn't like you, it's because you didn't like what I was doing and you were trying to help me. But at that point, I didn't see that. I was using you personally as an excuse. Oh, Ron just doesn't like me, and but over time, we'll talk more about that as we dive into our conversation. But let's start with your journey. I know you've been sober for how long have you been sober for?
I call it 8+ years. Yep.
8+ years.
Yep.
Awesome. That's kind of when my journey just began, but you were already there. Awesome. So let's start with your story. Let's start with, we're going to talk about some hard stuff in this podcast, some vulnerable things and things that a lot of men are struggling with, things that are actually impacting men. And I would love for you to just dive into your story, kind of when the first time when was porn introduced to in your life?
Okay. Yeah, that goes back a long ways, just because I'm older than you are. So I was probably 8 years old, and some friends invited my brother and I to spend the night, and they were the first ones to share some magazines from their father's room, or stack, if you will. And it was the first time in my life that I had ever seen anything like that. And like many young guys, I didn't know quite what to make of it. I'd grown up in the Catholic Church, so I had some sense of right and wrong, and it felt wrong, but it felt in something like I wanted to learn more about it, see more about it. And so that was the earliest stage that I can remember that occurred. And as time went on, it was an on and off thing, because it was getting access to pornography. I didn't even know what it was called back then, but to naked women, if you will, in images, was not a simple thing. And it wasn't something that, that took my whole mind away at any time. I was still obviously in school and doing a lot of other things, but it was just such an intriguing piece for me growing up. And then began to see it even some in my home with my father and grandfather, and that was news to me as a kid, that was something that, that they might be involved with. But so that was kind of my early recognition, that there were things like that were kind of risky, but titillating, I guess you would say, to a young boy. And it just went on, and I'm trying to think, through my high school years and that sort of thing, we kind of try to find more access to it. Would swear off of it for months at a time, knowing that that it was wrong. But but it had an early hold at growing on me.
How has porn affected your upbringing? As you know, you said you were 8. Your teen, high school, college years, and into marriage. Okay, what was that like? Yeah, was porn part of your life throughout those 5, 10, 20 years into marriage, or was it like?
Yeah, I think to some degree it was. Again, when I was 22, I accepted Christ, and so I guess I began being hit more with how wrong it was and felt, and I wanted to be a man of purity. I was still single at the time. I was still drinking alcohol, and for me, oftentimes the response to it would be, if I was drinking, I would be more open to that and to other things in life that I normally would have stayed away from as a young Christian man. And I did believe to a large degree that, if and when I got married, that, the pornography would be left behind. That was a thought that I think a lot of men consider and think that, hey, as long as, as I'm married, and then I'll be both true to my wife, and I won't have any need for, images of nude women, etc.
So you're saying that after you got married, you didn't stop watching porn?
Oh, you caught that, huh? I think it was less often, but it had a hold on me. There were images that were of perfection, and that of course that's what they try to make everything look like it's supposed to be so wonderful, something that you can't have no matter who you have as a wife or a friend. And I continued to believe that this was an issue I had. I didn't really think of how it might affect others in my life. At the time when I was 27, I stopped drinking. That to me was my problem. I was a functional alcoholic, if you will, and moved into a 12-step program. And for the last 36 years, I've been without alcohol. And for a long time, I felt like, okay, that was my addictive personality I was leaving behind, and I didn't really look at pornography or anything like that as a big issue for me. If my wife wasn't up to being intimate, then why wouldn't I, try to find another outlet? But it became more and more a thing where that took more of a hold of me. And I think my emotional level of intimacy with her began to pull back. And so those are things, as I've come to learn, that's very common amongst different men who feel like this will only be a problem until I have somebody else that I can be intimate with, and then the pornography issue will go away. And that was the furthest thing from the truth.
Wow. I want to stop for a second on your alcohol sobriety. I know this is, something we didn't even discuss, but let's talk about that for a second. I know you've been sober for
36, almost 30, 36 years.
36 years from alcohol. Yeah. What made you stop? Why made you stop drinking? Yeah. Is there a connection? I want to see if there's a connection between pornography and alcohol for you, for you personally.
Yeah, right. Yeah. When I was 16 years old, my mom passed away, and all of a sudden we were left with this household that was kind of rudderless, if you will. My father was still active in the military, and I was the oldest still at home. We had another 14-year-old and a 9-year-old still there. And all of a sudden, all the safeguards that my mother had been kind of there to provide were stripped away. And we were mourning for her death, but didn't even know how to mourn. We weren't a family of very intimate speakers. We would talk to each other. We would share educational things together. We would share sports together. But talking about real feelings was not part of our acumen as a family. And so my father began to recognize that, that he may have a problem with alcohol, and began to go to some meetings and brought home some literature that I actually looked at and thought, I think I was 18 or 19 when he brought that home. And I began to think, somewhere down the line, I may have to take this seriously, because I was already seeing in myself some of the same ways that he drank, and others in my life were feeding right into that, because I found my group to be people who were drinking and doing various other things too. And so I began to consider that, and along with that, if there were scenarios with other women, et cetera, alcohol would give me less inhibitions when it came to dating and doing things, that I normally wouldn't have done in a sober way. So at some point, right about at 27 years old, I began to recognize that I needed to do something about that. And that really was the first big step for me, to begin to talk to others in an accountable way, and also to face my own part of what I had done as opposed to what everybody was doing to me. I began to realize I had to make amends to other people. That was part of my recovery process. And so it started to open the doors for me for what part I played in that and what part God plays in that to help forgive, because I had so much bottled up because of my mother's death, because of my father being both distant and also absent for years at a time away at the military. They usually would have a year away and that sort of thing. And it sort of, I felt a little bit like that I didn't really have a parent to speak to about that. That just was not part of our growing up. So quitting the alcohol and moving into a sobriety program really helped out with my understanding there.
Let's continue with your story into marriage. And
Yep.
you said that getting married did not stop you from watching porn. So that's a lie, basically.
Well, it's what I said was true, but you're saying it's a lie that if you get married, you're gonna have it.
Yeah. So the misconception that a lot of men have: hey, if I get married, I'm gonna stop watching porn. I'm gonna be free because I'm gonna have my wife. She can please me.
It was as a thing, especially growing up in the church that I did, and then becoming a Christian with it. There was a sense of shame, a sense of hiding it that was important. I would be in men's Bible groups, and we would kind of touch on lightly, does anybody struggle with every so often, yes, we do, of course, but we would never get into really, let's talk about reality. Let's talk about, what that really means when you struggle. Struggling often is sort of a code word for acting out or, in with pornography or going, beyond that with affairs and that sort of thing. And a lot of the guys in the church weren't ready to really go there. And I wasn't either. It was kind of like I knew we needed to if we really wanted to break through, that, but it wasn't happening. And so I went along with that. And, but I had learned that alcohol and drugs were a numbing piece to making you forget the things or be willing to do the things that you wouldn't normally want to do. And part of it was numbing my emotions of growing up in a home that didn't really have a lot of discussion about emotions. And first alcohol and then porn and really kind of mask that. And I think that's a very common thing for a lot of men.
Let's continue your story.
Okay.
Let's continue with your, you're married, so you had your first kid, second kid.
Right.
So you guys have 4 kids.
We have 4 children, yeah. Two daughters, 2 sons. And, as we continued through our marriage, we put our children in private Christian schools. We went to church every week. We were, I guess you could say in some ways, a model family. And truly, I think my children, even during those times, would still say that they had good parenting. They had a loving household. We were still very open to, hugging and telling our children we loved them and teaching them right from wrong. But in the back of my mind, there was always a bit of hypocrisy in all of that because of what I was doing that was a secret to my family and to others. So that, again, a lot of that is retrospective, looking back on it all. When I was going through that, I might get angry at them for doing certain things that on the outside might be a little bit going overboard. My wife would go, gosh, all they did was, not eat their meal and you're angry about it, etc. Again, as I look back on it now, I realize that a lot of that anger was at myself for, the life that I was leading, behind closed doors, if you will. And so it took a lot of time for me to begin to understand that. And there were times when my wife and I would kind of look at it and say, we're almost feeling like roommates now versus kind of husband and wife growing. And we would go to, weekend, marriage conferences and that sort of thing and get some great advice and do some good things. But we were growing apart in our emotional aspect of it. And yet we were presenting this great, family picture of it. And I don't feel it was fake. It was the best we could do, best I could do at that time.
How did your wife discover that you were addicted to porn? I mean, you were married for 20 years.
Yeah, there were definitely times when I would be convicted and feel like I would go cold turkey, if you will, to just say, hey, I'm stopping that. Because there was always the sense that I wanted to someday. And, it was just a Holy Spirit in my heart saying, hey, this isn't right. So, but I didn't have the motivation, I guess, at least I didn't feel that I did. There was something holding me back. And the story that is true that occurred was I was going off on a business trip 12 years ago, and I was in the airport, and I saw a little note sticking out of the pocket of my suitcase before I got on the airplane. And I thought, what's that doing there? I don't remember putting that there. So I was getting on the plane, reading it as I was boarding, and all of a sudden, my heart sank, and it was a note from my oldest daughter, who at the time was about 16 years old. And she had found history on our family computer that only could lead back to her father, of some of the images and some of the things that were being looked at some days prior to that, apparently. And so I'm leaving on a 3-day trip. I'm ready just to turn around and come back and don't know what I'm supposed to do with all that. And to her credit, at 16, she said, I'm not going to talk to your mom, her mom, about that. But I really am asking you to get help and do something. And so I really felt, rightfully so, that my back was against the wall. Because if I chose not to do that, and she followed up with me and said, did you ever do anything? And I couldn't answer her truthfully that I had. I really feel like she could have been the one to blow open the doors to my wife about this issue. So I told her I would, and very quickly, when I got back, actually set up an appointment with a man who deals with this and is a therapist and a counselor. And
what were you experiencing? What were the emotions when you read the letter, and what are the next 3 days after when you came back? When you confronted your daughter, what was that? What was the atmosphere in the house? How did you? Do you remember those feelings?
Absolutely. It was, I guess, as close as I could get. Say it was like a little nuclear bomb had dropped in my life, because all of a sudden, all of the carefully hidden things that I thought that I had been doing were being blown up, and I knew that there was just no going back. I couldn't cover that back up again and go back to life as it was. And my heart probably palpitated hard for 3 straight days, wondering, how am I going to do this? And what's it going to be? Because I knew then that I needed to share truthfully with my wife, what this life had been like. And so I actually went to my first meeting with this gentleman. I managed to get one literally right the day I was arriving back at home, and I didn't even tell her I was going, because I wanted to see what it was about. Maybe he would give me some insight as to how you go about sharing this with your loved one, And so I did that, and I came home and just with anxiety, unbelievable anxiety, just asked her if we could talk, my wife and I, separately or quietly in our bedroom, privately. And I shared with her, what my story had been about. And all of a sudden, I think the scales fell from her eyes, if you will, about now I understand. I understand why we've been so remote with each other. I understand, why you've been standoffish. I understand why our intimacy levels have dropped, because you didn't have interest, and all those things. And it all was just in a matter of minutes that this took place. So it was very cataclysmic, if you will, in terms of how it all occurred. And I still knew then that I, had to have a better conversation with my daughter, who had found all this, and apologize to her and all that was going to lead to it coming from that.
How did you build back trust after after you shared the story with your wife? I mean, that just, what was the process?
Yeah. It's funny because it was 12 years ago that this began, that this story of redemption, I guess, or recovery began. And the building back of trust was kind of, I guess, that old thing of 1 step forward, 2 steps back. I'd feel like I was making progress. She would, and then something would remind her or trigger her, or an argument would entail that would make her feel completely like we were back at ground zero. And so that first 4 years of me going through individual counseling on a regular basis and feeling like I was making strides was positive. But it sort of had some backsliding about 6 months into the fourth year, and I know when I had to share that second time with her that, hey, there's been some backsliding there because we were getting some odd emails that she had seen 4 years ago, and said, why are we getting those types of emails? And it wasn't ever a situation where I was reaching out to anybody personally. But computers track your what you look at and that sort of thing, as I think most people know. And all of a sudden, these strange emails were starting to come through, and I was just laying in bed with her one Saturday morning. She said, "Why do you think those are coming back again?" And my first thought was, I'm going to lie about this. But a split second later, I thought, this is what I have to tell the truth. I'm learning that that's what's necessary. And I did. And it was like a bigger nuclear bomb had gone off, because she had thought that for 4 years we were gaining more trust. We were redeveloping our relationship. And here it was again, I had failed, if you will. But I really felt that it was important, but only when confronted, for me to tell her, hey, things are starting to go back into a bad way. But that truly was the beginning. And when I talk about having 8+ years of sobriety, that was because that was in December of 2015. And since that time, I've been 100% sober.
When you say sober, what does that mean?
Sober means what we would call no physical acting out in any way and no viewing of any pornography. Both of those things, I had believed for the first 4 years and that last 6 months, that as long as I was physically not acting out, that I was good. And if I was viewing pictures that were inappropriate, that was better than not, it was sobriety, but it was not great sobriety. And I only came to learn as I came to a group of men led by a counselor that their definition and now my definition is both of those have to be in sync together. You can't say, well, I'm acting out physically, but I'm not looking at anything. Or you can't say I'm looking at inappropriate pictures, but I'm not acting out, because both of them are for the same goal, which is to numb your mind, to take you away from life's challenges. And just like any other addiction, whether it's gambling, drugs, alcohol, the main goal of pornography and physically acting out or cheating, on your wife or whatever, is all oftentimes because we're trying to numb ourselves from the hard feelings of life. And that took me a long time to learn why. Why was I doing this?
So let's stop on that for a minute. So what feelings were you trying to avoid? What feelings were you avoiding with pornography?
Yeah.
What were the emotions?
Yeah.
What was the pain that you were covering up? Because you and I know that porn is not the problem.
Right.
Porn is just the results of something that's hurting inside of you.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tough it's not tough to talk about it, but I want to make sure that for the sake and respect of my current family and my family that I grew up with, that I'm never bagging on my father or my growing up. But in our family, it was just very much about, you do the right thing, you look like you're doing the right thing, you go to church, you go to confession, you do all these things and you act right in public, and you're a good kid, and you get good grades, and you be respectful. Those were all important things to learn, but none of that ever said, hey, if you're having an issue or you're having a problem, come talk about it. It's safe to talk about it in our family. There wasn't a lot of hugging. There was never an I love you. It was maybe like, hey, I'm your parent. You know how I feel. That's the sense that we got. And then again, as I said, there was the separation. When my mother died, there was the separation from my father, both emotionally because he wasn't somebody to be close, and the separation from him during many weeks and years when he'd be away. And so a lot of that was, what's my significance? Am I everything I can be as a child? And so much of that entered into my adulthood without me even recognizing that was part of it. And that's the part of that I really like to hit, and that you and I have talked about so often is, as you said, it's pornography is not the issue. It's a symptom of you trying to either forget things that occurred that hurt you as a child, dealing with an argument that you just don't know how to deal with and it's bothering you inside, so you go act out. Those are things that are really the emotional part of it that I think until I began to get into recovery, I didn't understand. If I had a big project due at work and there were going to be executives there for me to present to and that sort of thing, it was anxiety leading up to it. Hey, I did great at it. Let's go reward myself. I didn't know the two were connected. I just thought like, hey, that's just two different things. Only later did I begin to find out, that was the two kind of go hand in hand, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Let's talk a little more about the building trust. How long did it take you to rebuild trust, and what steps did you take? Like, what are the? Right. I know you mentioned building blocks. 2 steps forward, 1 back. What was that like?
Yeah. That probably was the most challenging part of it, and I can remember, when I finally got it right and figured I was doing the right thing and we'll talk more about what the group and accountability is like. But I had started that process because I began to recognize that doing therapy solo helped me understand the the intellectual part of sobriety from pornography, but it wasn't giving me the outlet with other men and that sort of thing that we'll talk about. So I early on, I thought, hey, I'm doing all the right things. I'm checking the boxes for you, honey, and I would say, when will you forgive me? And she would say, I'm not ready to. I will when it's time. And that was so hard for me, but obviously very hard for her. And she early on, began to recognize that this was just like devastating, like you mentioned PTSD. She used to use that term, and she learned it in some counseling and things that she had gone through. And I first wanted to kind of dismiss that and say PTSD is for something much larger. It's for men who've come back from war. It isn't for an emotional thing between a husband and a wife. How can it be PTSD? And that hurt us because I think she really felt that I was not fully understanding of the depth of the hurt that she was going through. And so when I finally began to understand that and to be able to talk with her about that, and through counseling, began to be aware that, hey, this can be just as hard, if not harder, on the person that you're with as it can be on you, if not more so, then we began to start to make progress. But she asked me if I would be willing to get off all social media, even though many of those were not triggers for me, but to her it was time spent not focused on our relationship and focused on her and our family and on the things that were important. That, by me being willing to do whatever it took, I think that started building trust. And then when she saw me, start the process of getting into a men's group which you and I, have been part of for many, many years now, and the fact that I was being diligent about going to that and not saying, hey, I started it and I'm done with that now, that it became a thing where I, proactively said I'm going to be going to that every week. And then reaching out I went to Every Man's Battle, in 2016, and that really allowed me to see a large group of 60 or 80 men, and then smaller groups within that weekend get together and just start to share things that I think we both never thought we would with other men. Those began to see it. And the fact that I went to Every Man's Battle proactively, because she had talked about it a few years before, and I had said that's not for me, started to just inch back some credibility and trust. But that first year to 2 years for her and for me were very hard. She used to claim, I feel like I'm walking on eggshells. She would feel that way. And I would think she was exaggerating, but I no longer feel that way. I do really, truly believe that that's how she felt, and rightfully so.
What part did accountability play in your journey of recovery and sobriety and, becoming the man that God has called you to be?
Yes. Yeah, that was the missing piece for me. I had God. I was fairly active, we'll talk a little bit about, your self-care, which can be exercise and that sort of thing. I've always been pretty active in a lot of that. But the accountability part of it was always a blind side for me. I didn't know that speaking with other men and being accountable to other men in this journey that we're on in recovery was such a big part of it. And each week when I would sit and listen to you guys' stories and you'd listen to mine, and we would all, laugh, and smile, maybe cry. It took a weight off of my shoulders, and I think that was the same thing was happening, through the group, because we were finally able to talk about things in our life, emotions, sharing all the things that we've been ashamed to get into with other men. I had lots of friends, but they were men that you could ride next to in a golf cart and talk about football and sports and maybe family and that sort of thing, but very rarely get into anything too deep other than that. And in this group, we were able to talk about reality, talk about how we'd failed, talk about successes we had had. And you'd walk out of there going, why is it that I feel so much better? Because you could really kind of, I think, this is the model that God, and I think even Jesus with his 12 apostles had, was to have other men keeping each other accountable. And it was the missing piece for me that I just had never had. I thought I could do this by myself, and I wanted to do it by myself way back when, because I felt like I'm never talking about this to any other guy. I will figure this out. And I tried that year after year, and did not have the success that I've had in the last 8+ years, because I finally found other men that I would pour out my challenges with and listen to theirs. And just by doing that, it would be magically let go at that door, and you could walk away and say, I think I have hope now, one day at a time.
Is it weird being part of that kind of group? I know, is it weird going to a group and like sharing your heart? Because it's not a normal thing to do. Like we don't, like I have friends outside the group, and I don't just start talking about my problems and my addictions with them, because it will make them uncomfortable. And but I know there's like 9, 10 guys in our group that I can just walk in and I can just, just spit everything out, and it'll be a total normal environment. Like, how was that for you? What was that? What was the process?
Yeah, it was exactly, I guess weird is probably a great term for it. Uncomfortable initially. I had, at that time, 25 years of sobriety and gone to other 12-step programs. So I had the knowledge of how you could
with
share.
Alcohol.
Yes, with the alcohol. And so I had the knowledge and kind of experience of how to share that and share your, your past challenges with other people. They could be male, females, et cetera, big groups of different people that had gone through that. So I had a little bit of understanding about it, but I never tied into how that could work with this issue. And certainly the first time I ever walked into a group meeting like that, it was very odd. Anxiety there to kind of say, I'm going to be talking about things that I've never shared at the time in 50+ years, with any other man. And so it took a kind of a leap of faith, I think. But I had been shown, that this meeting was available by the guy that was my counselor for a few years. And he said, I really think that's the missing piece for you. And I trusted him. And I think that really was a big help.
Yeah, I'm glad that you trusted him, because when you came into the group, I was already in the group for about 2 months,
right?
But I was a totally different David. This is you're talking to a different David.
I know that. Yeah,
and that journey started. I'm just going to interject here a little with you and I. We not that we became buddies or friends, but we started talking. But you would always not confront me. That wouldn't be the right word. You'd always challenge me, because the group is very there's a lot of love in that group. Like people love and respect each other. It's built on love. But you would start poking at me, David. Hey, what about this? Why aren't you sharing this? Why aren't you sharing this with your wife? Like, why aren't you being vulnerable? And I just started developing this almost like I literally started developing a hate towards you. Like, man, freaking Ron. But over time, as God started peeling things off me and just working on my heart, and I still remember the day when I came home, and I'm like, it was a 50-50. It was like a 50-50 chance, because you were like, David, you got to come clean before your wife, Irina. You got to tell the whole story. Hey, you got to tell her the whole story and what you've been doing. Whatever you've been sharing in the group, you got to share it with your wife. And I knew it was a 50-50 chance that she'll stay or she'll leave me. And you were like the biggest supporter. Hey, David, what's going to happen if you don't? Like, you're going to keep living this life. So you were like the guy who motivated me and challenged me to become the man that God has called me to be. And because the fact that we're sitting here is, it's because of you. And I give that credit to you and to God. God used you to make me a better and a stronger man. And I really do appreciate that. But that love and hate relationship, as you were talking about how, it's not normal for us to share and to be vulnerable with other men, but that's what we do in our accountability group. But that healing started happening in my life and in your life. Let's talk more about what is healthy accountability? Like, how do you see? Because there's people that say, "Hey, I could do this by myself.
Yeah.
I don't need other men. I can just take God and I can do it by myself, and I'll take care of this." What does healthy accountability look like?
Okay. Yeah, and that thing about God, just saying, "Hey, God," and I can't tell you, and I know with all the men I've spoken with over the years that we all have a lot of that same story that says, I prayed to God, I asked God, will you take this temptation away from me? Will you clear my life up of this so that I can just move on and nobody will have to be the wiser? And I used to think, he's not hearing me. He's not listening to me. And then only when I began to do the group process, sometime into that, did I realize, he said, I'm pushing you towards, sharing this with other people. I'm pushing you to be part of an accountability with other men. And when you do that, I'll start doing what you're asking. And I only found that God began to work on me, with me, when it was through other men. It just blew my mind that, wow, he hasn't been ignoring me. If I would have been willing to do this 10 years ago, he probably would have said, go for it.
Wow.
But I kept thinking like, no, I want a bolt of lightning to say you're cured, you're healed, move on. This won't ever have to be shared with anybody. That was just a period in your life. But the accountability part of it became like, hey, if I'm not willing to open up and share not just what my story is like we've done here, but what's happened today, what's happened this week, then I can start building that wall of secrecy back up again. And I have to do that. I can pray to God about it and ask for forgiveness, and I do believe he will do that. But I don't believe he works it that way with us not sharing it with other people. And I don't know why. I hope to ask him that someday. Instead of just, snapping his fingers and saying, you asked, I'm curing you. It didn't work that way for me. And I've found it very, very few men, if ever, that it does work that way with. So accountability is not only just being in a group once a week, because that gives you 6 days and 23 hours of time to do your own thing. In my mind, it's also about whether it's texting, phone calling, meeting, that my big energizer is meeting with people for breakfast, for lunch, for coffees, by phone on a weekly or daily basis if necessary. And I found that really helps cure my heart and keeps me honest, keeps me pure, if you will. And sometimes it's like the medicine that you don't want to keep taking because you want to get lazy. You don't want to do it. I don't. I won't speak for others. But it became a thing where, every time I'd leave from a meeting of coffee or time or a meeting with other guys and share that, I felt like, you know what, I've got the strength to do this again for this week. And people who shy away and fall away from doing that, it's almost a guarantee that they're going to get back into that lifestyle that they try to get away from. And everybody has a reason why that they do that, but it's almost like you can just see what's going to take place if they don't find a group of accountable men who can listen without judgment and who can laugh with you and cry with you, put their arms around you and tell you, hey, it's going to be okay. And that you can hear, hey, their story's a lot like mine. I can relate to that. And that's what it's all about. There's no magic. It's just that you're listening to other guys and going, yep, I know that exact feeling. And somehow that just helps cure what's going on inside of you. And you can move ahead for that week in a much better feeling and being in step with other people and more in step with God and the Holy Spirit, I think.
Very interesting. Let's talk about triggers. How do you, you've been sober for, 8.5 years. I know you're not perfect, but I know you're a good man. You're a godly man. You're a strong man. You lead a good family, 4 great kids. You've been married for 32, will be 32 this year, 32 years. How do you deal with triggers? Like because I know we live in a physical world. We're spiritual human beings, but we live in a physical world.
Yeah.
How do you deal with triggers.
Yep. At Every Man's Battle, they talked about the bouncing of the eyes, which really means if you go further than just a glance and say, that's nice, but that's not for me, then you're asking for trouble, if you will. And so by bouncing the eyes, it's really a thing where you just kind of say, okay, looking the other way, putting my thought process into something else. If not, that can become a huge trigger, and that's not images, that's real life around us,
Basically, when you're walking down the mall,
Yeah.
or you're at a grocery store, like there's people that dress provocative.
Exactly.
Like you're gonna walk into them no matter what.
Yep. So all of that can be unhealthy thoughts that you put down into your brain's hard drive, and later that can come back to haunt you if you're not careful with that. Triggers can also be, even if you're on an innocent website, that advertisements can come through, or just little videos can come through that you don't even expect. Whether you're watching TV and an advertisement comes up and all of a sudden, it's like, I didn't see that coming. What do I do with that? Do I fast forward through it? Turn the TV off? Do I get up and go do something until that advertisement's over? All of those things are healthy habits that from a triggering perspective can be very important to build purity and sobriety. The other things that can be triggers have nothing to do with anything you'd normally think of with kind of traditional images and pornography. It can have to do with anger at a child, anger with your spouse, anger with someone at work, feeling insignificant because someone overlooked you when you really worked hard on a project. All of those kind of things are critical to understand. Those can be triggers to you because they hurt you emotionally. They hurt your heart. They make you feel not part of. They make you feel not as good as. And those things are absolutely just as critical. Those are things I never tied into what this addiction was about. I just thought it was all about, like, hey, if you make the choice to look at somebody and bring that into your mind, that's your own choice. If you make the decision to open up a website and look at images, that's your own choice. Those are the triggers. But to me, the biggest triggers were the unseen things that I didn't know about, which were some of those things I discussed, were anxieties or feeling hurt by something someone said, being left out of something that you weren't invited to. All those little things can be triggers if you don't look at them and go, hey, if I'm not careful, that can lead me back to unhealthy behaviors.
So, like, I think it's very common. You see, if a pretty lady walks by and you just see some guy standing there, always like they would check her out, hey, up and down, up and down. So that behavior, that what you mean?
Well,
it becomes a subconscious thing for a lot of men. Like they just do it. They don't even know that they're doing it, or they know they're doing it, but they do it so casually that obviously leads to something else. Like, hey, if you're like checking out every woman that walks by, that means you're probably doing something else. You're probably watching porn on the side.
Exactly. And like you said, that can become such a habit that you don't even really think about it. And to be honest and fair about it, those are things that Tammy had to remind me about, my wife, as time went on, that said, I've seen that happen with you. Oh, you did? I didn't even know I was doing it. And that's sad, but that's the truth. And so those are things that I think can be triggering. But as I said, I think the biggest and most important part is really that kind of emotional part that can be triggering, that leads us to that sort of thing that we don't even know. And only with help and maybe understanding and experience later on, we begin to recognize those are just as critical to understand and to recognize if you want to have a healthy life going forward.
I want to clarify a few things on the triggers and I guess the quality of sobriety, because you mentioned before in your story that you went 4 years into your sobriety. You were thinking, hey, if I don't do anything physical, but I can just watch pornography or inappropriate images, that was fine with you. What do you define? What is quality sobriety? Because we, in our group, we talk about it. You could be sober, but you can have, you could be looking at things like double taking, meaning like if you look at a girl that's walking by, you look at her once, second time, third time, and then you can have some fantasies about her. Like, what is quality sobriety mean to you?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it makes such a big difference in terms of your whole life quality. It's easy to say, hey, I'm going to check the box every day of not looking at porn, not acting out. Okay, I'm good. And like you mentioned, there's another level which is really important because it can lead back to those bad behaviors again if you let it. So quality sobriety is saying, hey, there's a little thumbnail, of the wives of NFL players, and that used to be a thing like, well, of course, I want to see what the wives are like. What's wrong with that? That's lack of quality, because basically, if you go down that hole, then there's just all sorts of other things that it can lead to. And so the same sort of thing of just say, hey, I'm put myself in a position to where I minimize any of those things coming up. If I go to a Hooters restaurant, I'm just using that as an example, and I'm sitting in there saying, I'm just here to have a meal, you're putting yourself in a very challenging position. You're probably going to reduce your quality of sobriety by sitting there and taking in what's there. That's just an example of it. But there's so many different things. But a lot of it has to do with today's world of being on your phone, on your laptop, on your computer, and knowing immediately this is not an area I can get into. I won't. And starving your brain of those images, and in the long run, it can become a positive habit. So the quality of sobriety is really having the habits in place. And if we like, that can kind of lead us into some of the things that we've talked a lot about, which are, the pillars, I think, of what good sobriety can be.
What are the pillars of like good quality sobriety? Or does it just happen like this? What are like the steps and the pillars you can apply to your life?
Yeah. Well, we've talked about the accountability and the the working with other men. That to me was the biggest one that I did not have, and I think it's a big part of it. I absolutely feel it's a must to have God involved with this. We wouldn't be sitting here if it wasn't for God's grace on us. Amen. For what we've done, and I don't take any credit for this period of time of sobriety. I give God the credit because I couldn't do it on my own, and it didn't happen. He led me to the path that allowed me to start to have some good sobriety. And so God, accountability, and then we don't talk often, but self-care is such a big one. And what can that mean? Self-care can mean, it doesn't mean just brushing your teeth and taking a shower every day. It means taking care of your vessel, your body that God has given you. And that might
mean... the temple.
Yes, exactly. So exercising, eating well. I mean, it doesn't mean you can't enjoy different foods and that sort of thing, but good nutrition. It can mean meeting other people to be energized by sharing with them, and we have to have that social. If we don't, I think that's a big part of what we can lead us astray again. So I kind of just consider the pillars, and you've talked about the Spirit. To me, that's God. Other men, and then self-care. So self-care really means, like, on a daily basis, can mean the health and exercise part of it, but it can mean being planful about your day. Because if for me, and I think many other men, if we get slothful and just say, I'm just going to let the day come and see what happens, with no plan, there's a lot of rabbit holes that you can go down, especially given the thousands of channels and things on TV and that sort of thing, that you can just say, I'm just going to sit here and flick around and see what comes on. It's kind of a recipe for future disaster. So the self-care part of it has so many aspects to it. It really has to do with, reading the Bible, being part of other groups, but also keeping your body sharp as you can.
What do you do with that? I know you're a sports guy.
Well, yeah, and I'm far from saying that I'm on the far end of what that's about. But for me, I've found things like pickleball, walking the hills where I live with my spouse, my dog, or myself. I play golf. That's not necessarily a big physical thing, but sometimes walking the whole course might be a 7-mile walk. I still do a little bit of jogging. Every morning for the last 4.5 years, I've woken up and either done, now I'm up to 60 to 70 push-ups and doing planks on one morning, and then the next morning I do sit-ups and crunches, and I always do band work at night before I go to bed. Just I lay it down in front of my bed and just to stretch and to get a little bit more of that. Those are just things from a small perspective that I do to try to keep my body in better shape, and it just makes me feel like ready to take on the next day more so than if I'm just not careful and just had a bowl of ice cream instead.
I love that. So from what I'm hearing, so there's no like instantaneous healing and freedom that can happen overnight. Like, hey Ron, you're healed. Like here you were watching porn, you're addicted. You've been doing this for years, and boo.
Yeah. I've told so many people, and only because I've experienced it. The program or the work that we do in this is simple, but it's not easy. So we all want the instant change. You can, one day be an active addict and the next day not, but to have success the next day, and the next day, and for a year and 2 years and 5 years, takes work. It takes effort in those areas that we've talked about.
So the renewal of the mind needs to happen.
Right.
Like Paul writes about it. The renewal of the mind, the transformation of the mind needs to take place.
Right.
And that in the mind, and then that captures the whole body.
Right.
You got to do your physical. Because if you take care of your temple, you feel good about yourself.
Right.
You feel like you have energy. You feel good about how you look in the mirror. You feel emotionally good. So the renewal starts happening.
Yeah, I think like anything, the fallacy is, and a lot of people, especially, I would hear this early on in a 12-step program with alcohol, they would say, well, how long do you have to do that? You hear that a lot even in groups that we're in. Well, are you, so if you do that for 6 months, then are you good to go? Almost with any human being, and this is just the human condition, we will lapse back to bad habits if we don't have constant reminders and constant experiences and learning of what we can do to become better. And it's like asking somebody to say, hey, if you go to the gym for a month, won't you be good for the rest of your life? Or do you have to keep going back? Why? Well, because your body and your muscles will atrophy. The same thing happens with your addictive behaviors. You start to atrophy back to what you were. And if you don't continue on with it, and it's hard because you want to say, someday, am I going to not have to say I'm an addict? Am I going to have to say, can't I just say I'm another healthy human being like it looks like everybody else is around me, although they're not, mostly? No, it takes continuous work. So, but it's simple. It's not like asking you to go to the moon or perform a heart surgery. It's like, hey, do these 3 simple steps, but do them regularly, do them habitually, and you too can have success in this. And that's the hardest part, is because people want that quick fix that you mentioned.
That's so true. We're gonna go into our last section of our conversation. I know you're a good man, you're a strong man, you're a leader, and you have raised 4 amazing kids. Most of them are, you have 3 in the professional world. 1 is finishing college. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about your kids and me as a young father. I look up to you at the way you were raising your kids, the way you still raise them, and like all the little techniques you apply into like discipline and teaching girls and teaching boys. What were some of the challenges you had to overcome as with the pornography, raising kids? Because they were a lot younger when everything kind of came forward.
Yeah.
What were the challenges that you had to face during that journey?
Yeah. Well, first of all, as I look back during that time, prior to 10 or 12 years ago, there was, I've shared with you, I really felt there was still a lot of good parenting going on between my wife and myself, and there's still a lot of love with our children. So I don't have regrets and say that, that was a period where it was just an empty time for them. But what there was internal anger in my own self until I began to recognize what that was about. And really it was about me being ashamed of what I was doing in private and not being the best father I could be. But it wouldn't come out that way. It would come out that, hey, something is not being done right here, and probably be more angry than I should have been, or maybe more quick to go towards that instead of another solution. There was still love. There was still time that we just have great times together with them growing up. And I'll never regret any of that part of it. But the part I wish I had learned earlier was to love myself, and I could love them in a better, more fatherly way maybe than I did. And one of my big decisions 8 years ago was to sit down with each of my children individually and share my story in a brief way, but in a real way with each of them. And I didn't do it as a group. I went to each one of them over a period of about a week or two and had private time with them. And I talked, of course, to my wife about it and said, do you feel that this is appropriate? Because, I think the youngest one may have been 9 or 10, and the oldest one was by then 16, 17 years old. And she said, without a doubt, I think it's the right thing to do. And, in some ways it went perfect. And in some ways there was a challenge, because they began to see like, hey, this is not the dad I knew, that what's going on here. And that's taken some years of healing, and in some cases, one-on-one therapy, with us sitting together, maybe me and one of my daughters or me and one of my sons, together trying to do those things. And lots of steps forward and steps back where I think like, hey, I'm healed, everything's good. Well, I still had some lingering things that we hadn't figured out. And those have begun to really heal, and the relationship as they're young adults is gotten so much better because I think they began to realize like, hey, we know that every person is not perfect. What's been neat about that is I think, that it's allowed them to maybe open up with me more about things that were challenges for them that maybe I wasn't letting them do. I didn't know that, but I wasn't. And my relationship now, my kids are aged from 21 to 29, and it just keeps getting better every day, and that's a miracle. Because we were at a kind of a stopping point, I think, in terms of emotional health and that sort of thing, maybe, as they grew up and moved out and that sort of thing. But I think they've really seen my attempts to proactively work on it, because I'm never satisfied that being a father doesn't just end when they're 18 and they go off onto college and your job is done. It's if anything, it's just gotten more and more delightful, if you will, to have and see, what my children are doing and our relationship grow.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. And I think that's one of the things that really, really inspires me about our relationship is I see you as a dad, now, the two girls they're engaged. I made that public.
Yep.
They're not going to be mad at me.
Nope. They'll be happy.
Yeah. Congrats.
Thank you.
Married, 2 weddings, and then hey, grandkids.
Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Yeah,
but no, that's something we look forward to.
And then it's very inspiring for me to see a man, a different man. I don't want to say older man because I don't. Just man, many years ahead of me, but went through a journey, and then the way God restored you, the way God healed you. And then have a beautiful marriage, have great kids and success in professional world, and now you're retired, just playing golf and pickleball, and but I just want to say thank you for being that man, thank you for being a strong man, and I think you and I we joke around like what are the odds, me an immigrant from a totally different country came here, met you, and then I consider you like one of my best friends, like you're the guy who I can call no matter what. Like you've been, I can honestly say, like at the lowest point of our relationship with Irina, you were there. Like you were the guy who was like, David, hey, what the heck's wrong with you? Like why are you ignoring my calls? Like, hey, what's going on? Like you need to man up. You were there, and I want to say thank you.
Yeah. Well, I second all of that. Sometimes I joke around and say, hey, I have the unlikeliest good friend of mine, he was 8 years old, moved over from Ukraine, and he's somehow we got put together. And I think we will both say that some of the best times we have are just spending time together, chatting and thinking about dreams we have and that sort of thing. And I watch you. I knew you when you were early married and had no children, and going through the early times of all of this that we've gone through together. And watched as you've become more and more willing to be a husband and father to your children, and not afraid of the discipline, not afraid to be the man of the home, and obviously now leading to this where you're not afraid to say wherever this may go around the world, if it's to one person or hundreds of thousands of people, we don't know, but it's worth it. It's worth the risk. It's worth the challenge, and I. It brings me youthful thinking again to watch you, and what I love about, what you've done is you've brought other men into this now through retreats, through your small group that you started with your church, and you're very planful, you like to make goals, way better than I ever did. And as you said, I worked in the corporations for years, and we had to set goals and all that sort of thing. And for me, it always became like, hey, when I'm done with that, in my personal life, I don't want one goal that I have to, go for. I have them mentally, and I do have things that I set for myself, but not nearly as dedicated to putting it down on paper and that sort of thing as you've done. So I've learned from you in many of the things that you've done, and that's like the most unlikely pairing that God could put together, but He did for a reason, and that's the beauty of it all.
Exactly, He's just so good. God is good, and the vision for the podcast is it's one strong man. If we can impact just one more man somewhere in our city, in our state, in the country, in the world, if we could just impact one man to take up the cross and to become stronger. And then that will trickle down to here. He's going to impact his family, his kids, his wife, and who knows what God's going to do. We're going to trust God to take this message and if we can just impact one man, we ever achieved our goal.
Well, I just want to say one last thing is that you've been talking to me for several months about doing something like this, and watching you strike out and go forward with it, regardless of whether I was on board or not. I had reluctance because I've shared with you that I've talked to many individual men, many men in groups, many family members as I chose to, but it was always a situation where I could say, hey, are we in this together? I understand you're working on the same challenges, et cetera. This was a big risk. It's a big risk for both of us. You have a professional life ahead of you. I have many people in my life that that I'm friends with and that sort of thing who I haven't necessarily shared this with. But just watching, what you were willing to risk and do gave me an idea, and I knelt down and asked God, what am I supposed to do here? And He really, I believe, told me, you've been at this for 8 or 10 years. Have I led you wrong yet? And that was all I needed to hear. I have a trust that this is going to hit the right person or the right people, and I don't know how. I don't know what it's going to lead to. But the fact that you're sitting here in a studio right now that someone shared with you last week, you can use it whenever you want, for whatever you want, that's a God thing.
Exactly. No, praise God. It's it's a journey that I never saw myself go on. Half a year ago, if you were to tell me, hey, David, you're going to be sharing your story publicly, I'm like, you're crazy. This is not.
What are we doing? Is it too late to delete? No, just kidding.
Originally, and you know my story.
Yeah.
Originally when I joined this, the accountability group on Thursdays, my goal was hey, I'm going to share this. I'm going to share some stuff with you guys in this group. This is going to the grave.
Right.
Irina doesn't need to know about my acting outs. She doesn't need to know about how deep I was into my addiction. There's no need for her to know this. But now we're doing this. We're recording a podcast. It's just crazy when you just start trusting God, and God just leads you on this journey. It's like one step, second step, third step, and you're just trusting Him. And I'm excited for the future, and I know you're gonna be part of it. You're gonna be part of this journey no matter what. You're already in it, so you have no choice. Not going back. Ron, I appreciate you. Thank you very much.
All right,
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you.